Tonight, we won't count the crumbs left on a ledger or the coins exchanged under torchlight. Instead, we'll walk through narrow medieval streets where the air carries the faint sweetness of honey and the sharper scent of oil meeting fire. Somewhere beyond the clatter of hooves and the murmur of evening prayers, a pan hisses and the night gathers around it like an audience. Vendors call softly, selling fritters wrapped in paper that remembers 100 other snacks before it. And for a moment, under the glow of lanterns swinging in the wind, the world smells less like fear or famine and more like cinnamon and bread. So lower the lights. Let the warmth of the street press gently against your thoughts. And if your breathing falls into step with the quiet rhythm of footsteps on cobblestone, that's just the night carrying you with it. If journeys like this keep you company, you might share the time and place you're listening from. Perhaps the next frying pan waiting in the dark will be ready for you there. Perhaps the next lamp glowing down a London alley will be waiting for you there. And if you follow its light just a little farther, you might hear it, the soft clash of pans and the brief applause of oil meeting something small and edible. The night opens into a market where warmth pools in the air like a promise, where smoke carries the language of supper better than any signboard could. Picture a market street where the stones remember footprints better than names. You're not late. There is no late here. There's only the noise of small food being made quickly. A bit of meat, not large, not noble, meeting hot fat with a patient hiss. People called it many things. Rissoles, pasties, sausages with more confidence than clarity. It is polite in markets not to ask which part of the animal is the surprise of the day. But the surprise is always cut small, seasoned hard, and cooked until all the questions turn brown. A trader turns skewers beside a cartwheel and says nothing at all, which is the most persuasive sales pitch on earth. Travelers know this routine. You eat what fits in a hand, what can be wrapped in a scrap of bread, what can be held while coins are counted, what can be finished before the watch goes changing on the city gate. On fast days, the meat is suddenly fish, but the method doesn't change. Flour dredge, oil turn, salt. The theology is in the choice of protein. The comfort is in the sizzle. A clever wife might save drippings in a jar and pour it back for the next batch, and the jar becomes its own little chronicle of meals. If a bit of mystery remains after frying, a shake of ground herbs writes a gentle ending. It is an old cook's trick. When the story of an ingredient is unclear, finish the sentence with parsley. Some sellers prefer sweetness to secrets. The same street air, the same slow drift of shoppers, but this stall opens like a cupboard of mild miracles. Honey cakes sit in rows with the steady confidence of bricks. A boy with a scoop taps candied nuts into a paper twist that turns translucent at the corners. Fruit fritters come out of the pan with their own weather-hot light, temporary, and the vendor dusts them with sugar like the first snow that melts as it lands. A waferer passes through, carrying irons that look like polite torture devices for dough. He presses patterns into batter, folds the thin biscuit around a thumb, and hands it over with a nod. If you are very sleepy, you might think he is making parchment you can eat, and that is not far wrong. Some of these treats existed somewhere between a snack and a prayer. Honey had festival moods. Almonds were pounded into paste for special days. Even the simplest fried dough made people feel a little richer than they were. A tiny absurdity hides here. In a world of careful fasting and measured feasts, markets invented their own loopholes. A fritter is not a feast, people told themselves. It is only a sound. The sound of batter meeting oil is not technically a sin. Now the lane widens without hurrying, and kitchens grow quieter in their wealth. Here the indulgence is velvet-footed. Nobles like to be seen not eating and privately enjoy being seen not eating. Pies come with lids like stage curtains. A cook lifts one corner and reveals a landscape of cheese that migrated from far fields. Pears poached until they remember the sun, and spices that took more ships than cents to arrive. These are not street pies. These are conversations in pastry. There's blue cheese sweating under a blanket of warm dough. There is a bird you would not expect, stitched back into its own feathers for the table, theatrical and unbothered. People describe flavors as if they are politics, bold, subtle, loyal, treacherous. A platter of import says everything without saying anything. The table applauds by continuing to exist. And then there's the breakfast no one calls breakfast. Ale is technically bred with memories. Mead is summer in a jar that refuses to admit it is autumn. Wine is sweetened and spiced until it has the moral character of a dessert that shows up before noon and introduces itself as medicine. The cup is not small. The logic is tidy. If the doctor recommends warming the humors and the priest is busy elsewhere, a man can be both pious and hydrated. The serving boy yawns behind the screen. He knows exactly how many medicinal cups the household considers reasonable and how often the empty spice pouch must be replaced to maintain the fiction. It is very hard to be scandalized at breakfast when the sugar sits in an apothecary jar and the recipe begins with the word for comfort. Elsewhere, the comfort receives official comments. Medieval life really loved labeling things, and sometimes the labels were sermons. Certain treats developed reputations, not because they were dangerous, but because they were cheerful. A festival bun that made people too happy to remember the theme of restraint could find itself the subject of a stern paragraph. Churchmen wrote about the soul. They also wrote about butter when butter insisted on showing up in a season that belonged to oil. Bakers negotiated, sometimes with actual paperwork, to make their specialties during Lenten weeks, and the paperwork had seals as if the pastry were a treaty. Imagine a letter that says, very solemnly, "You may use dairy this spring if you promise to think about it." Meanwhile, be a size of bread measured loaves and punish short weight with public humility. No one wanted their name chalked under a pillory because a roll had been too light by a whisper. Bakers learned to weigh fairness with their thumbs. Even the phrase white bread turned into a conversation about virtue and vanity. The same debates appear centuries later around anything that tastes too pleased with itself. There's a quiet comedy in this. A town council scheduling a meeting about fritters with the same care it uses for bridges. The humor grows softer when spices enter the picture because these are not ordinary seasonings. Pepper counts as a small treasure. It can be rent payment, gift, or bribe, depending on the pouch and the story. A cook might write a handful and mean, "I am very lucky today." Sugar still lives more with apothecaries than bakers. It is sold in cones like well-behaved mountains. Chipping a little off feels like quarrying sweetness from a cliff. People call it a spice, which is a clue to how they think of it. Precise, expensive, occasionally prescribed. And yet it slides into recipes like mischief. A fritter in the market becomes a luxury by meeting a sprinkle from a cone that traveled so far it learned the words for weather in 3 languages. Even black pepper, which now sits on cafe tables with the air of a commuter waiting for a train, behaved like a minor prince when it arrived in a medieval pantry. Servants counted the grains after feasts, not because guests pocketed them, though some probably did, but because it was comforting to count. When you can measure your fortune in pinches, the spoon becomes a bank. Meanwhile, cinnamon glows like warm wood, ginger brightens like a small lamp, and cloves pretend to be tiny iron nails that hold the flavor of the world together. None of this is necessary to survival. All of it is necessary to the human habit of making small days feel large. When oil is hot, history forgets to be ancient. Medieval cooks did not invent deep frying, but they were faithful custodians of it. Dough becomes a sphere, a ribbon, a cushion, a knot, and all of them find the same path into shimmering fat. The result is familiar to anyone who has eaten at a fair with sticky fingers. A ring of dough appears that a modern baker would recognize without needing to adjust the century on their watch. A fritter stuffed with fruit, drizzled with honey, And dusted with sugar is a donut by any comfortable name, except the name hasn't been minted yet. Lard softens edges that flour can't. Oil writes gloss on surfaces. People bite and their faces perform the old human equation: hot plus sweet equals silence. The equipment is straightforward. A pan with honest weight. Tongs that have committed to their job. A wire basket, if you're lucky, though a slotted spoon will do. Recipes travel by watching, not writing. A daughter learns the right color from a mother who barely looks at the pan. A boy tasked with turning fritters discovers that if he counts to 6 and then to 5, nothing burns. The house keeps that count for a decade, and later a granddaughter calls it tradition. A very sleepy fact: some households kept a dedicated frying pot and named it, the way people name helpful animals because it heeded true and forgave mistakes. Once you notice these shapes, rings, cushions, pockets, you start seeing their descendants everywhere. A pasty bulges with stew and says hello as a ham pie. A wafer becomes a cone and holds a colder future it was never meant to imagine. A sugared almond travels from fairground to stadium concession without changing its mind. Gingerbread keeps the same polite spices and acquires faces at Christmas markets. Even the ritual of walking and eating, which feels modern in its hurry, is old. Street food is simply domestic life with better air and worse napkins. Some foods change names when they cross borders, the way people do. Others kept their names and learned to stand in line. The deeper legacy is not a single recipe, but a way of treating hunger as a series of small, solvable problems. You're on your way somewhere. There is a coin in your hand. The snack should be crisp enough to sound cheerful, soft enough not to argue with your teeth, sweet or salty enough to convince your day it has been seen. The medieval market solved that perfectly often. So does a corner cart now. The continuity is calm and oddly comforting. Batter, oil, patience, bread, heat, time. Sugar if you can, honey if you can, and a nap afterwards if the bench is empty. If you drift back to the beginning, to that ledger with its oily thumbprint, the story becomes a loop rather than a line. A clerk noted a payment for fritters the way a podcaster notes a coffee refill, with the fond assurance that the audience understands. Most meals in the past were sensible and unfussy. Junk food, the quick, the fried, the sweet, the unnecessary, was the bright punctuation people allowed themselves between responsibilities. Peasants did it, nobles did it, clergy occasionally issued memoranda about not doing it, and then quietly did it on feast days. Every few minutes you can pull out a small fact like a wrapped candy. Some towns had official searchers who checked bread weight, not out of cruelty, but because the community wanted fairness to taste the same in every mouth. Some fairs rented space to almond sellers who performed a miniature alchemy with copper pans and wooden paddles until the sugar seized just right and the nuts clicked like tiny stones. Some kitchens kept a spice locked up and carved a notch in the key to make it impossible to copy, a domesticated version of a treasure chest. None of this moves fast. It wanders like a shopper with no list who keeps finding the same stall because the smell is persuasive and the vendor never counts wrong. If you are still here, your breathing probably matches the old kitchen rhythms, short when the pan accepts a new ladle of batter, long when the sizzle evens out. That is the cadence these foods were meant for. They fill the space between bells, the space after a chore and before a chore, the walk from a market gate to a shade tree. A mystery meat skewer asks you to trust the cut and rewards you with heat and salt. A honey cake asks you to trust bees and flour and tells you a brief story about fields. A noble breakfast wine asks you to trust an herbalist as confidence that cinnamon in the morning is not a moral hazard if the cup is modest and the memory is kind. A fasting letter asks you to trust bureaucracy and suggests, with admirable optimism, that holiness can be itemized. None of these things solve anything larger than the next few minutes. That is why they work so well for sleep. They are pockets of time that do not demand attention. They borrow it gently and give it back warm, so we end without ending. A market that never closes because history does not ring a bell for bedtime. A kitchen where the oil cools and is saved because tomorrow will have its own snacks and its own small negotiations with appetite. Somewhere a clerk draws a line under a purchase and leaves an oily half-moon where his hand rested, a fossil of comfort. Somewhere a ladle scratches the bottom of a pan in a sound that could be a lullaby if you listen soft enough. And somewhere close to you, there is a crumb of sugar on a sleeve that will travel with you into the next room, which is less a conclusion than a gentle reminder that most good stories are simply meals you remember slowly while you fall asleep. You might not expect a small, slow flame to have a social life, but medieval candles kept more calendars than lords did and minded their manners about it. If you're still awake by the time we get to the 18th century candle taxes, feel free to subscribe very gently without waking your thumb. If not, that's fine too. The flame will carry on whether anyone is taking notes. Evenings used to arrive as a practical event. The room would tilt from work to warmth in a soft, predictable way, and somebody would say something like, "We'll have a light," and that meant tallow most of the time. Tallow was ordinary, which is not the same as unimportant. It had a smell that the poor called evening and the rich called tolerable. You rendered it out of fat that had already done a long day of being helpful, and then you asked it politely to be helpful again. Cooks saved drippings, but chandlers saved resolve. The process was easy in theory and considerate in practice. Melt, clarify, wait, dip. Cotton wicks hung from a rod like a tiny laundry line of future flames. Each pass through the warm fat felt ceremonial without announcing itself. Dipping required patience that clocks could only envy. The first coat made the wick modest. The third promised competence. The 10th looked like an intention. The rod was flipped to keep things even, and now there were twins. Two candles growing the same life at the same pace, which is an oddly calming thing to watch if you don't have better plans. People counted dips the way they counted prayers, not aggressively, just to know where they were. Children were allowed to help as a reward for being quiet. This is how you create a peaceful civilization, one wick at a time. The finished tallow cooled with the attitude of bread crust, respectable and a little proud. It bent if you asked nicely and smoked if you didn't trim the wick. No one blamed it. Tallow did its best and asked only that you forgive it for being itself. There were other ways to coax a flame from humble ingredients. Rushlights were the minimalist cousins who arrived uninvited and somehow improved the mood. You peeled a marsh plant into a soft ribbon, dried it near the hearth, then let it drink a shallow dish of tallow until it forgot it had been a plant. It burned on a slant in a small iron clip, half lamp and half jug, giving a quick, useful light that insisted you finish what you were doing before it lost interest. Housewives liked rushlights for mending because they admired anything that could be brief and helpful in the same hour. In better months, people scented the rendering with a sprig of something optimistic, a twig of rosemary, a polite piece of bay. None of this fooled a room into thinking it was a church, but it made the air feel like a conversation you wanted to keep. Tallow candles were made in ranks steamed to the pound if you were frugal, 12 to the pound if you were planning to read a recipe for pudding slowly and with feeling. The numbers mattered because the numbers behaved like promises. 12 to the pound meant you believed in your own evening. A candle that size burned long enough to get from a quiet supper to the part of the night where sentences forget to end. Beeswax occupied different furniture. It was the candle that had been to finishing school. No one bragged about owning beeswax because you didn't have to. The silence of it did the work. It burned with less smoke and more self-respect, and it smelled like a day that had learned good news and decided not to make a fuss. Bees collected flowers and accidentally manufactured an economy. Guilds noticed. Churches noticed even more. Wax had a way of making stone feel kind. Chapels filled with a patient glow that tallow could imitate only when it was particularly well behaved. When beeswax appeared in a domestic room, the room pretended it had always been that tidy. Processions loved it. Altars depended on it. Somewhere in a ledger, a monk wrote, "A stone of wax," and meant an amount large enough that the line needed a little bow afterward. You could pour wax into molds for consistency, with handsome little tapers marching out like disciplined recruits. Or you could dip it as you did tallow, simply slower and more dignified. Chandlers knew the difference by sound. Tallow muttered. Wax thought before it answered. Luxury started to orbit. Imported waxes arrived with ship names attached to them and behaved as though geography improved combustion. Some households kept a separate drawer for candle ends stubs returned from the chapel that still had useful evenings left in them. There is a domestic comedy in a noble kitchen quietly joining stubs together with a hot knife, the way sensible people make second soup from first soup. In wealthier rooms, beeswax gleamed from branch candlesticks that understood geometry. Everything looked measured, from the polish of the metal to the angle of the light on someone's sleeve. Even the smoke, when it finally appeared, behaved like a polite guest who could find the door unaided. We think of candles as romantic now. They thought of them as obedient. Nothing in the room shouted except the cat, and the cat did not care about lighting design. Then the talk turned to time. Candles told hours to people who preferred whispers. A marked taper with rings could measure a prayer or a piece of bread baking, which are more similar activities than they sound. You scratch notches at known distances, perhaps every inch, perhaps according to a memory that had already been passed through 3 sensible ants. And then you watched as the flame progressed with the bland fairness of gravity. In one country, the king was said to measure his devotions by candle, the wax lowering in a church where drafts argued about theology with the wick. In another, students set a pin through a lump of wax so that when the pool reached it, the pin fell with a tiny, triumphant sound like a secret consenting to exist. Households used candle clocks to reassure bread, to paste stitching, to promise that the visitor would not be allowed to overstay simply because talk enjoyed itself. It was a pacifist kind of timekeeping, never scolding, just slowly removing future from present until the matter was settled. The domestic toolkit answered with its own species of diplomacy. Wick trimmers were little scissors with a boxy nose for collecting the city tip at a tiny coffin. If you were feeling theatrical, that helped the next minute burn neatly. A snuffer looked like a conical hat on a stick and behaved like a librarian who had learned to end conversations kindly. People argued, gently, about whether to pinch or to snuff. Pinching pleased those who enjoy competence. Snuffing pleased those who enjoy equipment. There were spill jars for thin twists of paper to light a new candle without asking the old candle to perform above its contract. There were drip trays for wax that left the party gracefully. Pounce, a fine powder kept for drying wet ink, sometimes gentle to too greasy taper. An improvised solution, like putting salt on a path in snowy weather in the confident belief that matter likes being advised. Even the act of moving a candle from room to room developed choreography. A hand covered the flame. A body slipped sideways through a door. A draft reconsidered its plans. The whole house seemed to practice over years, a small ballet with light. All of this attention raised quiet bureaucratic eyebrows. Candles gathered laws the way cats gather chairs, not by trying, simply by being everywhere. Licenses for chandlers appeared because governments like to know who is boiling fat on an industrial scale. Markets regulated sizes so that pound meant something you could put on a scale rather than a mood. In one empire, officials wrote about the difference between tallow candles for kitchen work and wax candles for the front room, as if the flame were a uniform that changed with the task. Far later, taxes came along with soft shoes and firm intentions. In Britain, a duty on making and selling candles encouraged the public to take a sudden interest in lamp technology. You could still light a taper to answer a letter, but someone somewhere wanted paperwork to have happened first, and paperwork does enjoy happening. Unsurprisingly, resourceful households doubled down on rushlights and saved their receipts for real devices. Nothing kills a luxury faster than arithmetic. There were even rules about candles in theaters because audiences, like flames, benefit from management. The best part of these regulations is how confident they are about human behavior, as if any citizen confronted with a dark room and an unlicensed wick would calmly consult the calendar. Meanwhile, the flame kept evolving so slowly, it often arrived at its next century without mentioning it. The wick learned to be braided so it would curl into its own heat and burn cleaner without trimming. Molds improved so that tapers were round without anyone scolding them into it. Chandlers grew deft at reclaiming every scrap. Parish chests held drawers with careful labels, ends, halves, almosts. Housewives collected drips from the candlesticks after a feast and returned them remade as new beginnings. No metaphor was intended. The work felt less like thrift than like politeness toward matter. Beeswax kept the high altars serene. Tallow kept the kitchens honest. People could describe their evenings accurately just by pointing to a candlestick and saying, "This will do," or "This deserves better." The candle's social habits drifted outward into ceremonies so smoothly you might mistake habit for meaning. On winter nights, households blessed their lights, not because they believed the wick could hear, but because blessing makes people kinder to objects they see every day. Candlemas took place halfway between a solstice and a spring nobody trusted yet. People brought tapers to be blessed and left with the sense that the year had noticed their attendance. Wedding candles braided two flames into one domestic appointment book. Baptism candles promised not to complain about being dripped on by enthusiastic godparents. Even birthday candles found their way from complicated rites into kitchens where children learned that breath and wish are cousins. It is hard to find a ritual that dislikes light. The smallest flame looks like permission. If you stood near a street on a foggy evening in a city just discovering gas pipes, you would see the old and the new introducing themselves with appropriate reserve. A lampman raised his pole with its small hoop and coaxed open a flower of blue. Behind a window, someone trimmed a wick out of habit and decided to keep trimming because the sound felt like housekeeping. The change did not arrive as a revolution so much as a rearrangement of errands. Public spaces brightened, private rooms took their time. Candlestick makers added glass chimneys, then kept making brass because brass understood human hands. The little tools retired slowly. A snuffer found itself on a mantel with a sprig of dried lavender, puzzled but cooperative. A pair of wick trimmers admired their own shape and decided to become decorative, which is a fine penchant for scissors. If you listen closely, you can hear the way people spoke around a candle. Voices learn the distance at which a flame stops worrying about being a draft. Cards made a compact sound as they were laid down. Books made a softer promise. Sewing thread brightened as it approached the light and darkened as it was pulled back, which felt like a very small theater repeating the same play with perfect reviews. Now and then a moth attended the performance and received more attention than the text. Kitchens smelled of bread and a faint, friendly smoke. Parlors smelled of these and brass. Stairwells smelled like the middle of a sentence. Everything took longer and therefore mattered less, which is a relief hard to legislate. The economics hid in drawers, but were never quite asleep. A pound of tallow did not mean the same thing in January and June. Winter required a taller stack of evenings. Guild rules decided who could shape wax and when, which sounds stern until you realize it mostly created opportunities for festivals to happen on schedule. Traveling peddlers sold little bundles of rushlight reeds with honest, wet boots. Urban chandlers posted prices that included the weight of the string, so the public could feel clever when they remembered to ask for the deduction. In one town, a magistrate ruled that a seller could not advertise wax if the candle had two. Industrious, a relationship with tallow, and a scribe wrote this down as if the moral order of the world had been rescued by a scale that functioned. All of it, the weighing, the dipping, the trimming, made light a thing that could be shared without drama. You didn't hoard candles because candles are at their happiest doing the one job they have. Meanwhile, absurdities persisted with the serene confidence of tradition. Some households insisted that the last inch of a taper burned faster than the first, not because physics approves of suspense, but because people notice ends. Cooks believed that the smoke from a just-pinched wick tasted sour if you walked through it while carrying a custard, and whole families developed a muscular habit of stepping sideways at doorways with desserts. Priests warned acolytes not to whistle while lighting the altar, not a rule. Exactly, more of a working relationship with reverence. Children learned the precise angle at which a candle had to lean to drip a string of wax, long enough to be interesting and short enough to avoid commentary. Everyone had a story about a cousin who singed their bangs and then acted as if hair grows and surprised on purpose. These tiny superstitions didn't enforce themselves. They lived because houses prefer rhythm to rules. If counting relaxes you, there are numbers to collect and put away like polished stones. 12 to the pound is the cozy size for people who read and refill teacups. 16 to the pound resembles thrift in an apron. 6 to the pound feels like a festival where the host says, "Take another piece," and they mean it. 3 rings scratched on a taper will time a heartfelt argument about salt that ends in affectionate compromise. A braided wick curls into its own ash at about the same speed that butter reaches room temperature in a kitchen without opinions. Beeswax burns at a higher temperature than tallow, which is just another way of saying it stands up straighter when people are watching. The pin balancing in wax drops with a shy clink that could be a punctuation mark, telling a paragraph it has earned a nap. None of these figures will ever appear on an exam. That is their best quality. By the time we arrive at our promised taxes, the flame has already taught patience. Duties on candles encouraged innovation in lamplight and thrift in kitchens, not because governments hoped for either outcome, but because citizens are extremely good at solving problems that involve doing the same thing with fewer receipts. Unlicensed chandlery became a phrase that sounds like a crime from a very polite novel. Inspectors issued stamps. Households issued shrugs. When the tax ended, people felt the same relief you feel when you take a rock out of a shoe and find that you had adjusted your stride around. It so thoroughly you barely remember the original complaint. The flame simply kept being itself. If all this has drifted like a small boat on a quiet canal, that is exactly how candles prefer to be remembered. Not as symbols, not as crises, just as very patient servants of minutes. They lit sausages sliced too thin and letters written too long. They watched games of cards that lasted past anyone's certainty about rules and mended shirts until the fabric decided destiny was a seam. Their wax ran into elaborate sconces and very humble saucers with the same dignity. Their ends went into drawers labeled useful to be remade into beginnings labeled also useful. And when a new technology arrived with better ideas about brightness, candles did not complain. They moved over a little. They made room on the mantle. They agreed to show up for birthdays, for winter blessings, for dinners where the food is perfectly visible and somehow tastes better for pretending it is not. If you're still awake, you can decide very calmly whether the next minute means a wick trimmed, or a thought set down, or nothing at all. The candle will accept any of those decisions with equanimity. It does not insist on a conclusion. It prefers to end the way a good evening does, with a soft snuff that is mostly silence and a small thread of smoke, learning the shape of the room as if it has all the time in the world. You might not expect the distance from a king's nose to his thumb to organize a marketplace, but yards have been behaving like polite body parts for a very long time. If you're still awake by the time we get to the surveyor's chain with its 100 tiny links, Feel free to subscribe very drowsily, as if you're measuring the button on your sleeve. If you drift off before that, the numbers will keep counting themselves without you. People once measured by pointing at themselves, which is very human and also extremely approximate in a comforting way. A hand was a hand, unless it was a hand with gloves, which some people felt should count for more. A foot was a foot because it lived at the end of a leg and knew about walking. It had the authority of experience. The cubit was the distance from elbow to fingertip, respectable and mildly variable, like a good loaf in winter. The inch enjoyed a more botanical origin story. 3 barleycorns laid end to end, dried to their sensible selves, which gave everyone permission to stand around a table and discuss grain with scientific faces. If you line up 3 grains and find you have created a different inch from your neighbors, you are participating in an old tradition called close enough for domestic carpentry. Tailors had a fondness for ells which were longer than yards, and therefore implied ambition. An ell was as much cloth as you could agree on without losing friends, and it changed from town to town with the cheerful stubbornness of dialect. Markets did not dislike this variety. They simply preferred not to haggle about arithmetic. So towns installed certainty in iron. On the wall of a hall or the corner of a stall, you might find a fixed yard or an official. A bar worn smooth, where countless customers had pressed cloth against it and felt the comfort of standardization flow up through their shopping. Strike your measure here, a small sign might say, the way a brave scale in a bakery invites you to check the integrity of loaves. There were stories about royal arms that a particular king's outstretched reached to find the yard nose to thumb a whimsical rumor. That did the real work of reminding everyone that measures were supposed to be the same on Tuesdays as they were on Thursdays. A chandler hung his cords beside the bar like well-behaved snakes. A draper laid silk along the iron and pretended not to worry that silk had opinions about stretch. The iron did not have opinions. It hosted certainty in a room that otherwise loved negotiation. Numbers accumulated like lint in a pocket you keep using. 12 inches in a foot, 3 feet in a yard, and if you are feeling continental and L in England, was often 45 inches, but in Scotland it was different by a respectable argument, and on the continent, the L changed its mind as soon as you crossed a river. The mind drifts pleasantly while considering this. A cart loaded with cloth rolls has to remember not only tolls and weather, but the local personality of the L at the next bridge. Merchants grew bilingual in units, which is to say they became good at noticing when a yard looked unusually cheerful. Some shops kept multiple yardsticks behind the counter, labeled in precise ink. Flemish, Brabant, London. This was not deceit. It was hospitality. If you came in speaking Flemish L, the draper could answer you without making you do arithmetic before breakfast. The most restful thing about such a shop was the sense that conversion was a service like wrapping, performed briskly and without complaint. For land, you needed longer thoughts. Ropes learned to count. A measuring rope stretched across a meadow with calm authority. After enough days in the weather, it stopped arguing with itself about length and settled into a personality you could trust. Surveyors paced with a careful heel to toe, and then wrote down results with the mild pride of someone who has negotiated successfully with Horizon and Molehill. Eventually, the chain appeared, practical and a little theatrical, a length of wire divided into 100 links, adding up to 66 feet, which is 22 yards, which is 1 chain, a unit that feels like an idea someone came up with while waiting for the kettle. 10 square chains make an acre, which sounds like the kind of mathematics a person invents because it makes fence posts come out even. The chain jingles when you carry it and clinks when you drop it, and in either case the sound says, "Don't worry, I will be the same length tomorrow." Indoors, tailors measured in gentler metal. Early measuring tapes were ribbons of marked linen rolled into tidy cases with a spring that aspired to civility. They did not snap so much as sigh as they returned to their boxes. A good tape had numbers that didn't shout. It understood that the purpose of measurement is to prevent drama rather than create it. Tailors learned by habit how far a sleeve wanted to be in October and how much longer everything felt after a generous lunch, which makes sense because cloth remembers moods. The tailor's chalk drew a line that was half geometry and half lullaby. You could read a tailor's day by the fragments of tape stuck in a pin cushion like commas. If there were two with slightly different scales, it meant a customer had brought fabric, purchased in another town, and the tailor had decided to agree with both. Somewhere a scribe carefully wrote down the conversion between the palm, the span, and the digit, as if people would forget that hands have fingers. A digit, being a finger, is something you can trust in dim light. You can count without putting down your bread. The span, thumb to little finger stretched out, felt optimistic. The measurement of someone showing you a fish that keeps growing in the telling. Historical documents enjoy this specificity. A wall of 3 L's means a wall a person agreed to. A ditch 4 feet wide means an argument that will not need to happen next spring. One town ordinance specified the width of cart axles so that ruts in the road would harmonize rather than form musical disagreements, which is an elegant way to manage mud. Another required yardsticks to be examined on market days, the way watchdogs get friendly pats. The official would lay the town's iron next to the shop's wood and nod. A nod is the most relaxing unit of approval. Because people love tools that make them feel competent, accessories blossomed quietly. Folding rolls hinged like courteous elbows. Yard measures had brass tips to prevent enthusiastic corners from wearing down into fractions that lied. Some sticks had a sliding brass yard dog that bit the cloth just enough to keep it from being nudged toward advantage. A soft-spoken guardian against wishful thinking. Weights on cords steadied vertical measures as if gravity needed encouragement. Even the blacksmith shop got involved, stamping small numerals into mild steel so the town would not have to memorize how much a stone or a sack should weigh. All of this is astonishingly peaceful when you think of it, the way fairness occupies objects until the objects seem to emit it. Of course, units came with folklore, and folklore has a gentle way of making facts edible. People said a certain king decreed the yard as his arm's reach because kings have arms in decrees, and it makes a better story than committee work. People said cobblers measured shoes and barley corns because 3 of anything is a satisfying number, and also because barley corns do not send invoices. People said local owls grew longer in towns where wool was especially persuasive, which is an accusation disguised as a proverb. The truth, as usual, sat in a ledger looking patient. Inspectors checked measures, not because they distrusted traders, but because everyone felt calmer when the afternoon could proceed without debates about inches. When the new, tidy idea of the meter arrived with the conduct of a visiting lecturer, it did not rush into every drawer. It took tea with a yard and discussed decimals in a tone of interested friendship. Cloth merchants discovered that a meter behaves very much like an Eltsum yard if you let it. Carpenters discovered that boards do not resent being cut in centimeters, so long as the saw is sharp. The yard stayed for those who preferred to count by 3s, which is surprisingly many people, and the meter smiled and converted itself in the margins with exemplary manners. Tape measures learned 2 dialects printed side by side, and nobody felt especially bilingual for reading them. A number on the left answered a number on the right like twins who refused to quarrel. There were tender absurdities hiding in plain sight. A story circulated of a careful gentleman who kept a wooden yard in his pantry to measure loaves because he wanted slices that agreed with his butter. The butter, characteristically, declined to comment. In one village, the church key doubled as an official foot because the key was heavy honest and difficult to misplace. Choristers learned to stand quietly while someone measured the flagstones beneath them for reasons no one could quite recall. Tailors promised a yard and a nail for a bargain, the nail being an old fraction of a yard, and customers enjoyed nodding as if they, too, still spoke fluent nails. Surveyors carried spare links for their chains the way sensible walkers carry spare laces, and felt extremely competent when they used them, even if the repair took longer than the measurement. None of this urgency mattered. The world was content to become slightly more exact at a pace that allowed lunch. If you lean into the trivialities, you find a bedtime rhythm. The barleycorns are small. You can almost hear them whispering agreement along a ruler. The L is long enough to feel polite, but not so long that it requires a committee. The yard is a conversation you can have on the way to the door. The chain is a soft clatter against grass that tells hedges where they stand. The meter is a guest who brings orderly desserts to parties and leaves the recipe on the table. Even paper sizes later behave like people who enjoy folding themselves neatly. Half of this becomes that, again and again, until envelopes feel inevitable. None of it asks you to care. It only asks you to notice for a moment and then forget in exactly the way sleep likes. Shops closed, shutters slid, and yet the measures stayed awake in drawers. A wooden rule lay flat and thought about nothing. A tailor's tape drooped over a chair like a cat choosing to be a dimension. The iron yard on the market wall cooled slowly under the evening and remembered every cloth that had pressed against it, as if remembering were a profession. Out on the road, ruts accepted axles with the quiet satisfaction of things designed to cooperate. In fields, stakes stood where the chain had told them to, and the grass rehearsed growing around them without turning it into a speech. A clerk added 2 columns and wrote a simple total, and the numbers behaved themselves all the way to the edge of the page. It is pleasant to imagine all these objects ignoring heroism and choosing usefulness instead. If you are still awake, you might find your hand measuring the distance between 2 familiar things on the bedside. Table a book to the glass to the lamp, and producing a private unit, the span of sleep adjustable and unrecorded. It would be traditional to claim that kings invented it, or that it equals 3 barleycorns times a yawn, but you do not have to legislate something to enjoy it. Tomorrow the yard will still be 3 feet. The foot will still be 12 inches, the chain will still add up to a field pleasantly divided. And somewhere a tape will sigh back into its case with the satisfaction of a sentence ending where it meant to. The measures will go on measuring without urgency, which is the whole point of them, and also the most restful part. If you close your eyes now, the numbers will line up neatly in the dark and agree to meet you later. Exactly where you left them, and exactly as long as you need. You might not expect a small heap of crystals to assign people their seats, but for a long stretch of European evenings, a pinch of salt quietly sorted the table like a polite usher. If you are still awake by the time we reach the sleepy subject of salt taxes and the people who measured them with wooden scoops, you can subscribe very softly the way you would sprinkle a stew without waking the spoon. If you drift off sooner, the salt will go on arranging itself into little cones, whether or not anyone notices. Salt begins in patient places. On coasts, shallow pans were set out like mirrors that preferred sunlight to attention. Wind moved across them with the work ethic of a careful clerk, and the water forgot itself by degrees. When crystals finally appeared, they grew with the unhurried confidence of geometry. Rakes drew furrows. A worker with a hat said nothing interesting for hours and still managed to bring home the weather in a basket. Far inland, people quarried it as if the mountain had been thinking presumptuously about soup. Rock salt came away in chunks the size of practical promises. The taste was the same patience, only older. It is difficult to hurry a deposit that counted winters while cathedrals were still sketches. Merchants who handled both kinds developed preferences the way people develop preferences about kettles. Bay salt felt cheerful, mine salt felt reliable. A cook would pretend not to care and then quietly choose the one that behaved better in brine. At the table, Salt forgot the ocean and remembered manners. A grand household placed a large standing salt halfway down the board, a little tower of silver or Latin that did the social arithmetic. To dine above the salt was not a compliment to anatomy. It meant you had found yourself on the Lord's side, where conversation traveled without stopping to ask permission. Farther down, below the salt, the world grew friendlier and more practical. Knives were wiped on trenchers of yesterday's bread, which did the double duty of plate and sponge, and later became an act of charity with gravy involved. When small salt cellars appeared by individual settings, they looked exactly like tiny wells and behaved exactly like tiny wells. A pinch was drawn up with 2 careful fingers or with a little spoon that acted important and, to be fair, was. Guests minded the moisture in the air because salt felt it first. A damp cellar was an unhelpful mood. Hosts kept the salt where fires could see it and drafts could not. Nobody talked about this as a science, though it very much was. They just understood that comfort travels sideways across a table, from warm bread to satisfied salt to the quiet clink of a cup that has found its evening. The kitchen treated salt as time folded into flavor. Meat met brine because meat had plans to travel farther than daylight. Barrels smelled of forest and promise. A brisk shower of crystals earned the old name, corning, not because there was corn involved, but because the grains of salt looked like kernels in a language everybody already spoke. A joint rubbed well on a cold morning might see the next market in perfect spirits. Fish learned the same lessons and taught them to towns. A herring organized whole weeks by simply existing. Salted, it attended fast days with the kind of punctuality saints envy. Cod dried into boards the color of honest work and softer later when cooks coaxed it with patience and milk. Recipes spoke in quantities that felt human. A good handful, a generous pinch, enough to make the water remember the sea. Cooks tasted with their faces and their elbows as much as their tongues. You can tell a reliable brine by the way it grips a thumb. Somewhere a child tasked with turning a crank learned that the sound of grains passing through a mortar is exactly the sound time makes when it is pretending to be useful. Meanwhile, the church's calendar and the market's calendar arrived at a polite agreement to see each other often. On days of abstinence, Salt moved fish into the center of the table with the calm authority of a sexton showing you your pew. Lenten kitchens kept barrels like polite guests, upright, helpful, seldom the topic of conversation. There were jokes about how many ways one could dress a herring and remain technically obedient. Cooks explored all of them and wrote down none. Salt made vegetables into little survivors, too. Cabbage surrendered to brine with a sigh and returned weeks later as something sharper and friendlier, a tactic that feels modern and is not. Pickled onions learned to sit quietly until a pie asked for company. Every jar on a shelf was a postponement that had decided not to be anxious about it. Trade learned its roots by following salt. Mule trains carried blocks wrapped in straw and sounded like caution. Boats brought sacks that sweated slightly and believed in harbors. In some realms, the tax had a drowsy name and a wide reach. It touched every kitchen because every kitchen considered itself entitled to soup. Officials kept measures called minutes or muids or other units that felt like old acquaintances. A clerk dipped a standard scoop into a bin and leveled it with a flat wooden edge, a gesture so calm it could be a lullaby. The numbers went into ledgers that smelled faintly of fish and wax. Somewhere a guard drowsed over a gate while a cart creaked past with wheels that knew all the ruts by their first names. Smuggling existed as smuggling always does, but the most successful kind was simply buying early, storing carefully, and forgetting loudly that you had. It is hard to invent drama where barrels are content. Back at the table, etiquette developed delightful fussiness. Some households believed it ill luck to spill salt and invented remedies involving a shoulder and an imaginary devil. not out of fear, mostly for the pleasure of choreography. Others insisted that salt be offered, not seized, as if it were a guest with delicate feelings. The cellar often sat with its little lid slightly ajar, a signal that conversation was welcome to season itself lightly. Hosts took pride in salt that looked like snow that had decided to be helpful. They raked clumps into shining grit with the back of a spoon and pretended not to enjoy it. The phrase "worth one salt" wandered through languages with the nimble confidence of a proverb. Whether or not anyone was ever literally paid in salt, the idea kept the job. A quainer saying reminded people to take things with a grain of salt, which is exactly how salt prefers to be taken, minor, precise, and right on time. Small objects multiplied to serve it. A salt box hung near the hearth, its lid slanted so that diligence would roll back into place rather than lie about on the floor. A ceramic pot with a generous mouth sat ready to be pinched from without scraping knuckles. An ergonomic decision that preceded the word ergonomic by centuries. Spoons were carved with bowls so shallow they looked ornamental until you used them and discovered that restraint is a measurable quantity. In fancier rooms, a cellar's pedestal rose to the dignity of a landmark. People placed it with the same care one places a candlestick that insists on symmetry. There were traveling horns with stoppers for people who distrusted other people's seasoning and took their comfort in their belt. A cook's apron pocket collected a little crust of salt at the hem, a crisp souvenir of competence that survived the wash because fabric, like memory, likes to keep a corner of the past. Absurdities, gentle and inevitable, gathered around the crystals the way crumbs gather near sensible bread. A housekeeper taught that a damp day could be forecast by the way the salt sighed in the dish. She never claimed accuracy, she claimed entertainment. Sailors swore that a pinch tossed from the right hand pacified a kettle that boiled angrily in heavy weather. The kettle remained indifferent, and the sailors were soothed. Doctors recommended salt gargles with the authority of people who respect both chemistry and tradition. Patients complied because compliance tastes like something you can stop doing soon. In one town, a minor ordinance dictated the size of the vendor's scoop for selling salted nuts, which is a wonderful glimpse of municipal confidence. Nothing says civilization like measuring the tool you use to measure the thing you sprinkle on almonds. The modern shaker arrived so slowly that nobody argued with it. Holes appeared in lids. Anti-caking agents joined the party with the quiet helpfulness of guests who stack plates without asking. Restaurants practiced the little theater of forbearance, removing shakers so that chefs could believe in their seasoning, then returning shakers so that customers could believe in their agency. The table learned to negotiate in ways that would have made the old standing salt proud. Packets in cafeterias adopted a military neatness and an ability to travel that would have astonished barrels. The basic act remained miserly in the best sense, a tiny gesture that changes everything just enough. If you wander back through the years and stop again at the long board with benches and a draft from the door, you can feel the salt sitting at the center like a small, pale moon. Above it, the talk is padded with fabrics and opinions that do not raise their voices. Below it, the talk is practical and, frankly, more interesting. The knives gleam because someone drew them across yesterday's bread with a sensible hand. The sellers wink because humans enjoy doing things that make sense. A pie is sliced and asks for company. A pinch attends like a witness. A steward lifts the lid, and whether he is thinking about ledgers or lunch, the movement is the same. Measured, practiced, kind to the crystals. You can place your elbows carefully and feel the old vocabulary of manners rise up around you without demanding to be memorized. Salt keeps time without owning any clocks. It sits through winters and decides spring by listening to laughter. It pretends to be plain so that cooks can be clever without scaring their ingredients. It survives every argument about taste by refusing to be the subject of one. Even idioms that exploit it do so gently. To eat salt together once meant friendship durable enough to survive seasoning. The phrase lingers like a dish that keeps well. The workshop that sells little spoons continues to exist because people enjoy dignity for small acts. The field path where the taxman used to stand now hosts joggers who do not know why the lane is called what it is. And the lane, as lanes do, holds the information without insisting. We do not need to end, salt does not. It waits in a dish on a counter as if counters were invented to give it a view. A cook passes and taps the lid closed by reflex. Somewhere a pot simmers and recalls an ocean it has never seen. Somewhere a barrel that has lost its iron hoops lies happily demoted to a planter, still thinking about fish and unbothered by tulips. The crystals themselves are patient to the point of philosophy. They do not choose drama. They choose edges and corners and the calm dictatorship of small quantities. If you are still awake, you can let your tongue place a memory of salt where a thought used to be and notice how even that tiny act persuades the whole evening to agree with itself. And if your eyes close, the cellar will stay where it is, modestly pretending to be ordinary, and absolutely ready to make tomorrow taste like something finished on purpose. You might not expect a bed to have moving parts, but for centuries sleep relied on ropes you could tune like a quiet instrument and sax. You fed with straw as if the mattress ate hay for supper. If you're still awake by the time we reach the very patient tool called a bed key, you can subscribe with the same energy you'd use to puff a pillow barely any. If you drift off before that, the ropes will go on, holding up the night with their usual competence. Evening settled into the house the way flour settles into a jar, and someone said it was time to shake the tick. The tick was the mattress. Cover, a long envelope of tightly woven linen or sturdy ticking that tried very hard not to invite its contents back out. You stuffed it with straw in autumn, because autumn has opinions about bedding, and you changed that straw when it learned. Too much about you. Oat straw was popular because it made a civilized rustle. Wheat straw was fine if your ears enjoyed a little more commentary. People swore by feathers if the household geese had been industrious, though featherbed without a layer of straw underneath behaved like a cloud with administrative issues. A bolster ran along the head like a soft fence that kept pillows where philosophy could find them. Everything was tied to the bed frame with rope that crossed and recrossed, so the tick wouldn't become a hammock with ambitions. If you picture an old wooden bedstead with a grid of rope and hear the faint music of it, you would not be wrong. A bed sang under a sleeper, very quietly, in the key of twine. The phrase "sleep tight" has a comfortable sound, and although etymologists would like us to be careful, people did tighten bed ropes with a little tie-shaped tool, then nodded with the satisfaction of a phrase that fits the hand. The bed key turned each rope around a peg, drawing the grid from polite to supportive. In ends, where furniture met more people than it had the energy for, ropes needed attention almost as often as candles did. A host who loved compliments would tighten them before guests noticed. A thrifty person might use knots with names, clove. Hitch for steadiness, sheet bend for joining, half hitch for the corner that liked to pretend it wasn't a corner. The ropes themselves had seasons. In dry months, they behaved like well-read string. In damp months, they acquired personality and demanded to be convinced. Children learned to bounce on beds only after the ropes had been tuned. Otherwise, the bounce told a story about gravity that adults did not enjoy. If someone asked how firm a bed was, the answer was, "How firm would you like it to be in 10 minutes? Straw needed rotation the way bread needs turning in the oven." A good housekeeper shook the tick, which is to say, scolded it kindly in the yard and fluffed the contents. So the lumps didn't develop their own map of the body. The smell of fresh straw carried the same clean authority as line-dried sheets, long before detergent manufacturers learned to impersonate fields. People added dried herbs in small, hopeful handfuls. A sprig of lavender said, "I realize we live near a road, but I will pretend we live near a garden. A bit of pennyroyal whispered politely to insects that the sofa was hiring and the bed was full. Straw had a talent for rearranging itself during the night, so the morning ritual included encouraging it back into social order. The result was not luxury in the modern sense. It was something sturdier, like the satisfaction of a well-swept step-dot in cooler rooms, the bed warmed up by negotiation. Brass warming pans, hinged like quiet cymbals, carried embers under the covers in slow circles. That looked almost ceremonial. You moved the pan steadily so you didn't teach the sheet about fire in the hardest possible way. The trick was to warm the space where feet believed in happiness without browning the linen. People who disapproved of contraptions relied on hot. Bricks wrapped in cloth or stoneware bottles filled from the kettle. A brick had the virtue of silence. It also taught good manners. You learned where not to put your ankle. Later came the rubber hot water bottle, which looked like an oddly polite fish and lived in drawers all summer as if waiting for applause. All of this happens at the quietest volume, just the sigh of sheets lifting and falling, then admitting. They are prepared to be inhabited. Nightwear joined the conversation with its own respectable nonsense. A nightcap kept heads warm in unheated rooms and made portraits of sleep look like Parliament had adjourned to the pillow. Nightshirts were long enough to negotiate between the concept of a garment and the concept of a tent. Some had little slits for cautious walking that turned stairs into agreeable projects. People believed in pockets even at midnight. Somewhere a candle stub, a key, and a crumb of sugar were stored at chest level by someone who did not trust mourning. To remember everything. The phrase "turn back the bed" meant folding the covers to invite the body, as if the blankets needed a formal introduction to the night. Most bedding performed this choreography on instinct, a heavy coverlet at the bottom to commence feet, a lighter sheet above to commence skin, and over all of it the air itself, which, if you listen, purrs when it meets fabric. That has just... Then iron-dot beds had their own architecture. The four-poster was a little building inside the larger building, with posts that grew up like trees and a canopy that pretended to be a small sky. Curtains joined to keep out drafts and opinions. They slid with the gravity of old velvet and the memory of moths who practiced punctuality. In houses where rooms doubled as life and work, bed curtains created privacy that could be measured in inches and silence that could be measured in hopes. To tester, the wooden lid of the bed could be plain or carved with leaves that knew more about carpenters than botany. Some people hung a valance, which is the part of a bed that announces you have learned a new word and intend to use it. The bed's language made sensible distinctions. Bolsters were not pillows. Shams were not lies, only covers for pillows when pillows wanted company. A counterpane was not counting anything. It was just a blanket with ambition. The vocabulary alone could make a person drowsy in the friendliest way. Social life arranged itself around beds as if the bed were a domestic planet. Sitting up to receive visitors sounds theatrical until you remember rooms were cold and chairs were stingy. Beds hosted births, illness, letters, breakfast, and the complicated pastime of being almost awake. Travelers noticed ropes or springs, or the admirable refusal of a pallet to move at all. Household accounts listed one new rope for the great bed, with the same calm tone used for flour and soap. In some inventories, the bed appears first, not because it was grander than tables, but because it was the one thing the night considered essential. Beds were often inherited with the sort of solemnity we now reserve for a family photograph. One feather bed, two bolsters, and the curtains of dimity could anchor a will like a small chapel of comfort right in the middle of the page. Laundry days explained why bedding felt so honorable. Sheets were long rivers of fabric that insisted on being washed in sections without losing their patience. Lye soap had a personality, evolving from earnest to persuasive depending on how long it had been cooking in someone's opinion. Rinsing took place in water that told you what the season was. Winter water had theories, summer water had poetry. A clothesline sagged with the weight of domestic virtue and flapped like prayer flags with nothing particular to ask for. After, drying came smoothing, and smoothing meant heat collected in irons that were shaped like reasons. You could sprinkle the sheet with water and press until steam behaved, which it did if treated kindly. The smell of a pressed sheet can out-argue. A poor Tuesday. Not everyone slept alone, and not everyone slept the same. In smaller houses, a family became an arrangement of elbows and hopes. Children nested like spoons, set in drawers by someone who enjoys tidiness. Servants had truckle beds that slid under larger ones like organized thoughts. Travelers shared mattresses in inns not out of romance, but out of arithmetic. Beds were expensive and nights were numerous. Manuals advised sleeping on your right side after meals so digestion could feel admired. Some people believed sleep arrived in two pieces, the first and second, with a little wakefulness in between to discuss the day with the cat. You might rise to throw another log on the fire, look out at a yard that observed the moon with professional interest, and then fall back into the second sleep as if returning to a book left face down. Sometimes the bed left the room entirely. In summer, haylofts suggested themselves with irresistible logic. On very hot nights, a pallet near a window taught skin the geography of breezes. Sailors tied themselves into canvas hammocks that respected both gravity and the principle of persuasion. A hammock is simply a bed that has learned diplomacy. Soldiers knew straw that had recently been straw somewhere else. Monks slept in cells on pallets of obedience. Any place a horizontal surface met a tired person, bedding inventions appeared, like small civilities planted in soil. The important thing was to end the day under something that believed in the idea of covering. Sickness changed the bed's voice, but not its manners. A sick room had a rhythm like a slow metronome set to kindness. Trivets held broth within reach. A bell waited with decent humility. Visitors sat at the edge and pretended not to count the curls of steam from a compress. People exchanged the phrase, "make you comfortable," which is so practical it sounds like a spell. The bed accepted all of this without comment. It was equal opportunity furniture. It held triumphs like a baby whose hair disobeyed gravity, and disappointments like a fever that refused to learn. It creaked when someone rose in the dark and made the generous sound of fabric, agreeing to help. On feast days, beds sometimes were their best. Clean sheets were promised as a seasonal gift, as if linen had a calendar of its own. In rich houses, quilts were pieced with the kind of precision that made relatives nod. In modest houses, a patch became a geography lesson stitched in leftover. Syllables of cloth, bed rugs, the heavy wool covers that knew how to be winter, aired out on railings while the whole town noticed which family owned red. When travelers wrote home, they often praised the bed before the view, which tells you exactly how much landscapes count when your back does. There were tiny absurdities that survive, because they are true enough to be comfortable. A grandmother taught that you must always turn a pillow sunward once a week to encourage the dreams to ripen properly. A seafaring uncle insisted the foot of the bed should point away from the door so good luck could find what it came for without tripping. This is interior design with superstitions attached, the best kind. Someone else believed that crossing bed ropes invited quarrels, as if geometry had ethics. In some towns, the narrowest houses have the tallest bedsteads, perhaps to balance the conversation. Household cats audited all of this with interest because cats are minor deities of fabric. Change arrive the way it usually does, by not arriving all at once. Coiled springs crept in with new ideas about bounce and made rope beds. Look thoughtful rather than outdated. Hair mattresses filled with horsehair that behaved like an honest bristle took a long view of support. Doc Springs stacked order under indulgence and behaved like a polite chorus under a soloist. Feathers kept their job description. Straw moved outdoors to remember it had always been grass. The vocabulary added mattress pad and underblanket, words that sound like secretaries filing comfort. The conversation remained the same. How much firmness, how much warmth, which side, which season, and where did we put the bed key? Even though the bed key had quietly retired beside the poker. And the bellows, some beds recorded their lives. Carved headboards collected initials like guest books. Rope holes along the rails told you how many years someone believed in chords. A groove where the bed key rested, a patch where the tick had been mended in a hurry, a darker square where a warming pan lingered one January. These were the footnotes of sleep. House sales listed beds by room as if the rooms answered to them. The great bed, the little bed, the nursery bed that creaked as though it had a sense of humor. The quiet pride of a newly made bed survives every redesign. You smooth the sheet, you follow the edge, you tuck the corner with geometry learned so long ago that your hands have tenure. If you're still awake, you can test the old advice that says a pillow gains in kindness if you flip it over and give it a small ceremonial punch. The bed will not object. It has witnessed worse decisions and better naps. Somewhere in a drawer lives a fragment of ticking that once held straw and still smells faintly of last year's field. Somewhere a rope bed in a museum listens politely to visitors and keeps its knots to itself. Somewhere a warming pan hangs on a wall like a symbol that decided to retire into silence. The vocabulary of bedding, the bolster, the counterpane, the valance will outlive fashion by doing what good words do. Explaining comfort and then getting out of the way. We don't need to finish so much as taper. Beds understand tapering. The house is already quieter than it was at the beginning of this sentence. Ropes, real or imaginary, have been tightened to the exact firmness the night prefers. Straw is settled. Feathers have agreed not to argue. The sheet rests like a sentence. That knows where to stop. If you close your eyes now, the grid beneath you, springs, slats, ropes, whatever the century provided, will hold the hours with the same calm they held everyone else's. If you're still awake later, we can talk about the bed key with its tidy tea and the way it believed it was a kind of music. But we don't have to. The bed has already begun, and you can let it continue without you, which is exactly what beds were built to do. You might not expect a snack to need a permission slip, but some of the most harmless little treats in medieval towns came with paperwork, opinions, and a surprising amount of theology. If you're still awake by the time we wander through the very sleepy subject of butter exceptions during Lent, feel free to subscribe with the same energy you'd use to dust a bun with sugar barely enough to leave a mark. If you nod off, the buns will go on existing without you, which is what buns do best. The day begins the way most medieval days begin, with a bell that has ideas about time and a market that has opinions about appetite. A small stall offers something fried, something sweet, something that can be finished before a neighbor recognizes you and begins a conversation about fences. The treat is modest, which is why it is powerful. A ball of dough falls gently into hot fat and rehearses being golden. Someone sprinkles a little sugar that has traveled farther than most people ever will, and then pretends it is ordinary. The line is not long. It is merely inevitable. On fast days, the same stall rearranges itself, as if the saints kept a seating chart. Butter vanishes into the back room like a guest who has been asked to wait politely in the hall. Oil steps in with a brisk nod. Eggs become a rumor that no one can quite confirm. The result tastes like virtue pretending to be dessert. You take a bite and discover that reform can be crisp. The idea of forbidden's flavor sounds dramatic until you notice how calmly the rules are kept. The church calendar asks for abstinence on certain days, not because food is wicked, But because memory behaves better when it is interrupted, ordinary kitchens oblige with patience. Dairy takes a little vacation, meat declines invitations. Fish steps forward and becomes a minor diplomat for months at a stretch. Bakers learn to keep two versions of almost everything, the one that goes by its cheerful weekday name, and the one that wears a plain cloak and introduces itself as suitable. The timing is secret only to those who have never stood near. An oven, the oven knows. You can tell by the smell whether butter has been asked not to attend. People submit requests for exceptions with the same tone you would use to ask to open a window. Sometimes a bishop says, "All right, if you promise to remember why we're doing this." Sometimes he says, "No," and the town invents a better oil. The most practical theology is always edible. Food for sinners is a phrase that sounds stern in writing and rather cheerful in practice. It usually meant food that flirted with celebration on the wrong day. There were pastries that became suspicious when they remembered eggs too brightly in the middle of Lent, and pies that got themselves discussed because they implied a party when the calendar implied reflection. Bakers are excellent at diplomacy. They reduced a gloss, changed a filling, and smiled with professional innocence. A bun for Friday might be smaller, or the pattern on top might change from something exuberant to something a little pious. Someone scratched a cross because dough enjoys being decorated, and because a small symbol can persuade a conscience to relax. None of this is subversive, it's housekeeping. Kitchens have to live with themselves. The market never forgot sweetness, even when it was invited to be modest. Honey made its dignified rounds like a tax collector with better manners. Sugar arrived in cones and lived with apothecaries who treated it like medicine that had stumbled into a party. Spices acted as chaperones, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, standing in a sensible little row so that the sweetness looked like a respectable decision taken after consultation. A wafer pressed thin batter in irons and formed it around a thumb into a tube that tastes like nothing dramatic and everything agreeable. If you catch one fresh, the heat has a voice. It says, "This moment is enough." A candied almond clicks against its neighbors like small stones in a pocket. The long arguments about whether this is indulgence or simply morale are conducted in the mildest possible voices and resolved by eating. Some flavors ended up outside not because they were sinful, but because fashions decided they were suddenly tired. There was a brief affair with sauces that contained more opinions than ingredients, thick with breadcrumbs and colored to look like they meant philosophy. Time peeled them away. A few survive in quiet corners, mustard that remembers when it was a miracle, verjuice that tastes like someone coaxed a green apple into becoming a law. In certain kitchens, people experimented with almond milk not for reasons of trend, but because the calendar had placed milk itself on a temporary sabbatical. It behaved well, left a pleasant signature in puddings, and then stepped aside when cows returned to work. Recipes hide in manuscripts like polite ghosts and return if called. If no one calls, they go on being correct in the margin. Spices draw. Absurd circles around themselves simply by existing. Pepper behaves like a coin that lost its portrait. Ginger lights up a dish the way a thought lights up a conversation and then sits back. Cloves pretend they are nails that hold reality together. You almost believe them. Sugar stands apart, technically a spice in many minds, because it was purchased where you bought things that smelled like far places. It arrived wrapped as if it had secrets. In a world that saw salt as utility, sugar was a guest who had chosen luxury as a hobby. No one needed it. Everyone appreciated its ability to make fruit look intentional in winter. A fritter that meets a pinch of sugar learns new manners immediately. It straightens its shoulders, which is a big achievement for batter, if we're measuring sin in household units. The real improprieties often came down to weight and fairness. A loaf that was light by a whisper was more scandalous than a bun that wore sugar during Lent. The assize of bread looked after the poor with arithmetic. Officials weighed the day's loaves and made sure that money and flour respected each other. Bakers who shaved the edges of honesty met the pillory and, worse, neighbors' commentary. By comparison, a fried morsel on a fast day was a conversation, not a crime. Mind the Scale did more moral work than lectures about donuts. Still, sermons were preached with the affectionate sternness of people who have been offered second helpings and know how hard it is to say no. The miracle of moderation is that it feels good when you manage it and forgivable when you don't. You can stroll down the line of forbidden streets and feel how gently forbidden they were. Blood pudding drifted in and out of favor depending on where one stood in the map and in the year. Some people found it practical and honest, others found it eager. Eel appeared in pies with the optimism of a fish that knew the calendar better than the cook. It counted as lean and therefore acceptable, while also being exuberantly itself. There were pottages that leaned toward pleasure more than necessity, with raisins that looked like tidy punctuation in a sentence about porridge, if a dish made. People too happy on the wrong day. A clerk wrote a paragraph about it, and the baker quietly changed the recipe. This is how civilization advances, in paragraphs and revised fillings. The forgotten part of forbiddens and forgotten is the calmness. Tastes move like tide lines when no one watches. A city loves caraway for 20 years and then retires it to the cupboard where good ideas nap. A village believes in saffron as if it were a benevolent relative. Someday it will be expensive beyond reason, and recipes will treat it as a rumor that needs witnesses. Herbal syrups that were once proud of rescuing coughs become shyness itself. We mistake this drift for loss. It is just rotation. If you lived, then you would have a normal Tuesday that tasted of something we barely recognize now, and you would be embarrassed at how little you noticed, which is exactly what Tuesdays are for. The legal part arrives late and yawns. Taxes on salt were energetic. Taxes on sugar expected less from themselves and still managed to raise money because humans love sweetness and governments love percentages. Guilds had sensible requirements. Who could bake what and when, and how far a journeyman's enthusiasm should go without a master's nod. On certain days, the city might restrict the sale of festival cakes to festival hours, not to ruin anyone's happiness, just to keep the streets from believing it was always a holiday, when butter exceptions were sold to fund a tower or a choir. Still, people called it practical. You could pay to eat dairy on abstinence days, and while moralists aside, the choir sang under a roof that thanked cream. The line between piety and pastry is walkable if you step carefully. Spices worth a fortune took their time at ports, and porters took their time carrying them. The cost slid into the smallest spoon a kitchen owned. Pepper, measured by the grain, allowed itself to be borrowed from a neighbor in amounts that required pinches rather than scales. Cinnamon curled into sticks that felt like toys for responsible adults. Ginger arrived ground and then taught cookies how to be confident without volume. Saffron asked to be steeped and repaid the favor by making everything look like a better mood. These flavors behaved like guests who do not stay long but are invited back every year at the same time, and everyone pretends not to notice how much the household saves to make it happen. For every great spice voyage, there is a quiet scene of a woman with a wooden box unlocking her season with a key she does not misplace. There are small absurdities that keep the whole subject warm. A cook insists the fritter flips itself when the batter begins to sound like polite applause. It's not true, but the sound exists. A priest scolds a pie in a sermon with such affectionate specificity that everyone knows exactly which pie and exactly which baker, and both parties laugh when they meet at the market. A town council debates how many raisins qualify a bun as festival rather than weekday, and then decides to trust the baker's conscience, which is the most municipal decision imaginable. A fisherman swears that the best way to keep fast day herring agreeable is to talk to it about weather while you salt it, because the fish appreciates conversational salt. None of these behaviors can be proved necessary. All of them are remembered. Fondly, modern taste returns to these corners like a tourist who suspects the souvenir shop is the real museum. Cooks rediscover verjuice and act as if they invented green tartness. Donuts announce themselves with a confidence that would embarrass a medieval fritter, and then proceed to be wonderful anyway. Pretzels wear their old Lent shape with new street swagger. Almond milk arrives with a different story and the same texture. People line up for things that would make a 14th century market wife nod in recognition and then ask whether there will be enough oil for tomorrow. The continuity is not the recipe. It is the human habit of inventing small treats that make the day behave. The phrase forbiddens flavors grows comfortable once you notice how little forbidding actually happened. It was more like a constant, quiet conversation between appetite and calendar. The calendar wanted people to remember bigger things than lunch. Appetite wanted lunch to be pleasant. Cooks negotiated. They leaned on oil, learned the grain of the season, measured spice against coin, and found the gentle middle where a bun did its duty without calling attention to itself. Culture is mostly this: competent, forgettable decisions made by people who can tell when dough is ready by listening. The forgotten flavors are not lost. They are resting on a shelf behind words that take longer to say, waiting for a recipe card to flutter out of a book and remind a kitchen that it once knew how to be austere without being sad. If you're still here, you can hold a grain of sugar on your tongue like a footnote and feel how extravagant a footnote can be. You can imagine pepper counted into a mortar like coins counted into a purse. You can picture a baker lifting a tray and measuring out a pattern of raisins that satisfies both conscience and crow. Somewhere a clerk enters 4 cones of sugar, 1 small scoop of cinnamon, the usual ginger, and closes the ledger with a sigh of contentment that smells faintly of wax. Somewhere a bell says the hour and a street replies with the sound of oil considering batter. None of this requires your full attention. It prefers the drowsy kind. We could end here, but the subject refuses to conclude. Flavors do not end. They recede politely and return wearing different names. Tomorrow's calendar will smile at something that once had a paragraph written about it, and today's guilty. Pleasure will age into a shrug. The stall will heat its pan. A cautious hand will reach for the sugar cone with tongs that have belonged to the shop longer than anyone can remember. A bun will come out crisp and try to cool and fail gracefully. If you drift now, the market will keep its rolls and break them gently as needed, and the day will taste like it has always tasted when people agree to be mostly good and a little bit merry. And if you open your eyes later, the same bun will be there, a small round argument for happiness that nobody truly contests. You might not expect a pot of hot fat to be patient, but the calmest kitchens kept oil that waited without comment for the next small idea to fall into it. If you're still awake by the time we reach the gentle subject of beer barm used as a leavening agent, you can subscribe as quietly as a sprinkle of sugar finding the rim of the plate. If you slip under before that, the oil won't mind. It will go on murmuring to itself in a language that sounds a lot like frying. A market morning knows when batter is nearby. It is not a loud knowledge, just the way air becomes decisive. Someone has set up a portable hearth, a sensible pan, and a bowl with a spoon that rests like an oar on a pond. The batter is more opinion than recipe. Flour that remembers rain, a pinch of salt to keep it honest, sometimes a thread of saffron that pretends to be sunlight. The leaven comes from yesterday's bread in the form of a spoon of barm, not foamy. Top of ale that behaves like a cheerful neighbor. It lifts the batter the way a compliment lifts a conversation. Apple slices wait with their backs rounded like commas. A scrape of cheese hides under a cloth to avoid being useful too soon. The vendor tests the heat with a drip the size of a coin. The pan says yeses in that frying voice that is not quite a hiss, not quite a sigh, and the day becomes measurable in batches. What falls in first is usually modest. A ribbon of batter for a fritter that will become a lattice crisp. A spoonful that puffs into a ball with the self-esteem of a new pillow. An apple ring coated and lowered by hand like a small promise. The edges set before the center finishes thinking. This is true of many good things. The vendor turns each piece with a skimmer that looks stern and behaves kindly. If the fritter hesitates, a nudge persuades it to roll into its second self darker, more sure. When it comes out, it rests on paper that turns translucent at the corners like a shy admission. Honey walks across the top in a thin line that believes in gravity. A little sugar from a cone, chipped with tongs like geology performed by patient. People dusts everything with the same calm fairness that snow uses on rooftops. The calendar politely rearranges the fat. In November, after pigs have settled their affairs, lard is the practical choice. It understands winter. On days when the church prefers oil, the pan agrees, and the dough agrees, and no one feels scolded. Festival months bring out cooks who pretend they are not celebrating. They say the word collation the way people now say snack, and the ladle understands. Carnival leans toward indulgence with a grin it does not deny. Lent keeps indulgence on a shorter leash and finds that oil can be saintly when asked. In any month the point is warmth. You can eat with your fingers and finish while walking to the other end of the street. Shapes gather where grease is cheerful. There are long strips that twist and fry into ribbons that look like conversations. Caught in midair. There are knots that claim to ward off boredom. There are pillows that swell until they resemble excellent ideas. There are rings too, though no one announces them. The whole is a solution to center dough that refuses to hurry, invented by anyone who ever discovered that the middle would not quit being thoughtful at the same pace as the outside. The whole simply admits that time is not evenly distributed. The result is a circle you can carry, a geometry that agrees with pockets. People tell stories later about sailors and steering wheels and ingenious mothers with bottle caps. The pan has no opinion. It just prefers even cooking. The names drift from stall to stall as if litters are spices. In the Low Countries around, fruit-studded dumpling answers to a name that translates calmly to oil ball, which is exactly the kind of factual poetry markets admire. Across the river, a cook is making a crispella, which is Fritter's cousin who studied abroad and came home with a softer accent. In German towns, a crab fin swells under a lid like a secret learning to be polite, and if a spoon of jam wanders in later, no one objects. In Italy, a sphinge, or a zeppola, climbs out of the pan and finds itself sprinkled as if the weather had decided to be helpful. Farther west, a buñuelo accepts honey with the calm of someone who has stood near citrus trees all afternoon and chosen not to brag. None of these items is famous yet. They're just what's for sale. Equipment takes on personalities in kitchens where oil maintains office hours. The skimmer is the diplomat. The slotted spoon is the junior diplomat who writes excellent reports. The spider, that wide-wire tool, behaves like a lifeguard who never has to shout. The pan itself keeps its temper better than people do. A good pan forgives a slow morning and rewards a brisk one. The fuel decides the flavor at the edges. Wood becomes a small memory in the crust. Charcoal withdraws its opinion. Even the bowl does a little work. A batter that has rested for the length of a friendly conversation makes friends with oil faster than one hustled in. Before it knows itself, there is a rhythm you can follow with your eyes half closed. Dip, drip, hiss, turn, rest, dust, repeat. The vendor can count without counting. 6 heartbeats to the first turn, 5 to the second, and a pause while the paper admits to being touched by fat. A cue forms that never grows alarming. A laborer, with hands that have known wet rope, pays with a coin that has known pockets. A child receives a piece barely cool enough to hold and learns quickly about temperature and patience. A pilgrim buys one for the road and decides at the gate that roads do not deserve good food, eats it, and buys another. There's laughter, but it is the comfortable kind that never builds into anything the day would have to explain later. Even kitchens with more ceiling than weather know. The sound of hot fat. Manor houses borrow street ideas honestly. Cooks with embroidered sleeves still keep a pot for fritters. They might perfume the batter with orange water fetched from someone who knows someone with a still, or steep saffron until the world agrees to look festive. They will present the result on a silver dish that had a different job yesterday. The table pretends it has always understood carnival. The same fritter that looked friendly in paper looks dignified on a plate and tastes like it would get along with either surface. Upstairs and downstairs are less different than anyone admits. Once both have eaten something crisp, it is not all sweetness. Savory fritters exist wherever cheese pretends not to be glamorous. A shred of curd folded into batter makes a tidy revelation. Cod, cut to courtesy, dips and emerges with a boundary that makes sense. A leaf of sage, which usually has the temperament of advice, becomes briefly indulgent when dressed and fried and salted. Even herbs escape their roles. Parsley, which has spent years being garnished, leaps into the pan and announces that it can be useful at volume. The result collapses into a delicate heap and tastes like a hedge that just learned a secret. None of this is necessary. All of it is persuasive. A little administrative language always follows pleasure, as if order enjoys napping near good smells. Markets time their frying to hours that won't annoy neighbors. Guild rules whisper about who may sell hot food where, and the city nods along, without feeling the need to make speeches. The oil is strained at day's end through cloth that used to be a shirt and is now a system. Sediment goes where it will be forgotten. The clear fat returns to its jug with the self-esteem of a liquid that has made itself new. A day's earnings fold into a purse that goes under a pillow that smells faintly of sugar. Not because anyone distrusts anyone, just because money sleeps. Better with company. The technology of puff changes very slowly. Barm from ale raises dough because bubbles happen to like company. Yeast from a previous batch introduces itself to new flour and insists on continuity. In later centuries, chemical leavening will arrive with reliable manners, and cakes will lift for people who have no patience for waiting rooms. But in a medieval pan, time and warmth do the work together like old colleagues. The vendor wipes the rim of the bowl with the back of a finger in a gesture you can diagnose as habit from 20 paces. The batter's surface tells the truth in tiny craters. When it looks like the moon is considering weather, you can start again. Festivals. Approach from the calendar like ships you can see long before they dock. Saint days acquire their accompanying pastry in a way that makes everyone believe the two were born together. New Year's wants something round to imply the circle of the year. The market is happy to oblige with things that are round by accident. In cold months, the same fritter sits near a brazier and rehearses the art of being comforting. In warm months, it excuses itself earlier and tastes more of honey than of fire. The pastry does not mind. It trusts hands to remember what to do and mouths to explain the rest. There are tiny absurdities that refuse to be important and therefore become dear. A cook swears that a fritter knows you're watching and refuses to brown if you show off. Another insists you must look away at exactly the moment of turning, which is really just a method giving yourself a break from worry. A third will tell you, without truly insisting, that the oil prefers clockwise. If asked for proof, you will be told to look at the bubbles, which never answer questions but are happy to be consulted. The market lives on these small, confident jokes. They are deliciously unfalsifiable. Paper is the unsung hero. A twist of it becomes a cone that holds 3 tidbits like birds in a small tower. The paper begins white, turns transparent where the snack rests, and then dries with a faint map of what just happened. Housewives reuse paper until it contains a season. You can tell at a glance which corners were acquainted with honey and which favored cinnamon. Accounts are written on sturdier sheets, but receipts of memory, the crinkles, the delicate stains, stay in the kitchen drawer with string, and the pencil stub and constitute a perfectly adequate archive dot by now our fritter has. Relatives everywhere. A sailor learns a Dutch oil ball and brings the idea home without bothering with the name. A soldier stationed far from his mother's kitchen recognizes a German pillow fried in lard and considers for a moment the portability of comfort. A pilgrim returns from Spain with a story about a coil of dough extruded from a clever star-tipped funnel and eaten with something thick and dark that may have been chocolate or may have been a dream. The basic pattern repeats until it feels like weather. A warm thing, a sweet thing, a paper thing, a satisfied thing. You can watch the transition to modern junk food without needing a tour guide. A bakery window takes the place of the market. Cart glass where steam used to be. The shapes are officially rings now. The whole graduates from solution to signature. Yeast still comes to work, though baking powder has joined the staff. The sugar is granular and immediate. The honey visits on holidays. There's coffee, a drink that treats fried dough like a conversation partner. People stand in front of the case and select with dreams the same size as in the old market. 2 items, 1 intention, enough change for later. The paper bag makes the same translucent confession at the corners, then cools, then forgets dot. It is tempting to claim that one form becomes another in a noble line of succession, but kitchens know better. Things coexist. A medieval apple fritter would recognize a county fair stand by scent long before it learned the vocabulary on the banner. A Dutch oil ball would nod at a winter festival stall and find its own reflection in the glass. The modern ring would visit a monastery on a saint's day and feel perfectly at ease among pastries that spell the calendar in sugar. The continuity sits in the silky center that finally cooks through and admits it is ready. Regulation drifts into view like a clerk who understands both sides. Towns set times for street frying and distances from cloth merchants who prefer their fabrics unscented. Inspectors in later centuries test the purity of fats with methods that sound more like recipes than investigations. A scientist writes a paper on smoke points in a manner that would make a grandmother nod. Health becomes a part of the conversation in the way weather always was, important, largely beyond control, with daily practical adjustments that matter more than speeches. The pan heats anyway. There is an old-fashioned piece to the skimmers. Work at day's end. Oil is poured through cloth and returns clear enough to contemplate another morning. The pan is wiped with bread that was going stale and is now a story. The counter is dusted where sugar decided to be generous. The paper cones are folded flat and set aside as if sleep applies to objects. The vendor counts coins without drama and ties them with string because string likes being included. Somewhere, someone who meant to save half for later finishes it standing up and feels no guilt. We have invented many complex moral systems. None of them has improved the state of a person finishing a hot fritter if you're still awake. This is the drowsy part where details slow down until they resemble each other. Batter looks like quiet weather. Oil behaves like a mirror that is also a door. A ring settles on a napkin and leaves a perfect pointless halo. A cook taps the edge of the pan with the handle of a spoon, and listens not for information exactly, but for the comfort of recognition. Somewhere a sugar cone is becoming slightly shorter. Somewhere a skimmer cools on a hook and dreams of circles. We do not need a conclusion, because food like this specializes in the middle. It exists between hunger and not hunger, between morning errands and afternoon decisions, between the first bite and the moment your fingers know where to find the last grain of sugar. In the old streets, it tasted like a small victory over weather. In new streets, it tastes like a small victory over calendars and email. The mathematics have not changed. A bubble, a flip, a rest, a dusting, a pause. You could sleep here very easily on this pattern, with the pan cooling and the stall closing and the oil, patient as always, growing still enough to see the sky in it, which is exactly the kind of reflection that makes the night decide it has everything it needs. You might not expect the corner of a paper bag to have a memory, but when a hot pastry rests there and turns it translucent, the bag remembers markets that stood on cobblestones and spoke in the language of steam. The line is slow on purpose. A hand is warmer than money. Somewhere close by a pan says yes to batter, and a tiny bell on a door says yes to people. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about wafer irons quietly becoming ice cream cones, feel free to subscribe. As softly as you would tap powdered sugar from a sleeve. If your eyes close before then, the bag will keep its memory, and the pastry will keep cooling at the exact speed that makes sense to both of them. The simplest legacy is the hand pie that never learned stage fright. Medieval cooks folded supper into crusts so it could travel without complaining. The shape changed accents from town to town, but the motive stayed tidy. Stew wants a pocket, pockets want to walk. A crust is a handle you can eat. In one place, the edges crimped like a careful sentence. In another, it is sealed with the bottom of a pewter cup, because the cup was nearby and cups enjoy participating. The Cornish pasty, the empanada, the calzone, the little Jamaican patty that escorts a bus ride with polite heat, these are cousins that wave from different winters. A miner used the crimp as a clean grip and left it behind for the pit sprites, which is a charming way to describe throwing away the part your hands had been all over. A shepherd tucked lamb with herbs into a half moon and took the weather with him. A student in a hurry tucks cheese and something green into a folded rectangle and calls it lunch with a straight face. The continuity is not in the spice or the flour, but in the ordinary request. I need to move and eat at the same time without asking my day to sit down. Nuts survived with even less drama. A copper pan, a wooden paddle, a spoon of sugar, and patience. Thick enough to stir. Medieval markets practiced a small chemistry called panning long before laboratories learned to be jealous. Heat persuades sugar first to shine, then to seize into a white frost, then to melt back into glass. The almonds click like pebbles while this happens, which is the sound of a technique remembering itself. Today a stadium cone repeats the motion, as if it were a hymn. Cinnamon joins with the stubborn kindness of a spice that only wants to smell like holidays. Vendors measure by scoop because scoops are friendlier than scales. On cold afternoons, the cone is a hand warmer with snacks attached. A very tired clerk once ruled how big the scoop should be so citizens would feel correctly treated. The size drifted through centuries and arrived intact at a kiosk where a teenager learns, on day one, that sugar burns are persuasive and aprons are wise. Wafers led an accidental double life. In the Middle Ages, a wafer carried iron molds with patterns that looked like lace having an industrious day. Thin batter went in, a hinge committed, and out slid a crisp leaf that wanted to be rolled while it still remembered being soft. You could sweeten it with honey or pretend it was medicine by storing it near apothecaries who like to supervise. Centuries later, the same motion met a cold idea, and the rolled wafer became a cone that volunteers to hold frozen milk. The cone is still a wafer in practical shoes. If you watch closely at a street cart, the same choreography appears. Pour, press, peel, roll, breathe on your fingers, and act as if nothing remarkable just occurred. The pattern printed in iron becomes a pattern printed in muscle memory. Someone makes 2 extra and lays them aside in case a child drops one. The safety wafers are a policy older than the word policy. Pretzels walked out of Went and into street corners and never looked back. A loop with arms, a little knot that reads as tidy from a distance, salt like starlight where it catches the crust. The story about monks shaping prayers into dough is probably a courtesy rather than a fact, which does not make the shape less respectful. Boil, then bake, then sell while the heat is still confessing itself. A city learns the rhythm of pretzel hours without checking a clock. The modern mall has simply replaced the town gate without changing the scent. Next to the pretzel stands the bagel, which practiced the same boil then bake logic and acquired a commuter's temperament. Medieval bread rings fed workers who liked handles. Later they fed dawn routes and trains. A vendor's call shrinks into a printed menu, but the conversation remains. Salted or not, sesame or not, something in the middle, or a polite refusal. Butter is modern, Lox has opinions, but the chew is old and faithful. Gingerbread lasted because it never insisted on being only one thing. In a fairground, it was a spice cake with a faint medicinal alibi. In a guild hall, it was a stamped biscuit that wore a badge. In a kitchen, it was simply a way to make winter agreeable. The ginger is the part history remembers, with the gentler notes, honey, cloves, pepper, that grew up to most of the quiet work. A medieval baker pressed dough into carved boards. The pattern was a conversation about saints, seasons, or civic pride. Today, a cutter does the same conversation more quickly, and the shape becomes a house or a person with a disproportionate head who smiles without blinking. In both cases, you spread a thin glaze that dries like manners and hand the result to someone who needed a small ceremony more than a large dessert. Mulled wine nearby learns from the same spice drawer. Cinnamon sticks act like stirring spoons that retired into theater. Oranges float and pretend to be lanterns. The cup warms your hands, and the world decides to be bearable for another hour, which is an ancient technology masquerading as an evening dot. The fritter kept its passport up to date without changing its photograph. We already watched batter meat. Oil and graduate into rings with a degree in humility. The ring in modern costume now sits under lights and next to coffee. Yeast still lifts or chemical leavening obliges, depending on the century and the budget. Jam still hides in the straight-faced ones and finds people who like surprises gentle. The names enjoyed travel. Oliebollen took a ship and changed its vowels in America. Crapfin stayed to mind a cafe and argued kindly with the word Berliner. A county fair in late summer deep fries a strip of dough, forgets why, remembers sugar, and ends with the air soft with satisfaction. The paper tells the same story every year. Translucent corners, a greasy constellation, fingerprints that map. To delight, if a medieval vendor visited a modern shop, the only astonishment would be the machine that slices holes. The rest would feel like a long shift ending on time. Cheese learned the trick of portability early and keeps practicing it. Fried curd, battered or not, appeals to the part of the tongue that wants to be hugged. A cube of something politely aged becomes a squeak when battered and a sigh when melted. The modern nugget, family fish, cheese, chicken O's, a quiet debt. To cooks who knew that small means fast and fast means warm before conversation gets ideas. Medieval cooks had their own set of snacks with private lives. Little birds seasoned as if they were ambitions. Pies that hid more pies. Fritters of herbs that turned hedges into food. The present trims these into friendly forms and gives them marketing that is louder than the fry. The oil, unimpressed, continues to do its simple job. You can complicate a nugget with sauces that read as essays. You can also put a little salt on hot protein and feel civilization nod. Even the way we line up to buy food behaves like an heirloom. A queue is a moving table with no furniture. Medieval markets knew that order tastes better than urgency. You waited while the skimmer finished its sentence. You stepped forward when the paper cone had been wrapped. If someone spilled honey, noses accepted the sermon and feet practiced choreography. Now a truck parks where the road decides it needs a smack. Chalk writes a menu like a friendly legal document, and people take turns using minutes the same way. Tokens once ensured fairness. Now small buzzers tremble in pockets like bees with calendars. The exchange has the same tempo. A hand passes a warm thing to another hand. Money is counted or tapped or shrugged at. Someone bites too soon and pretends it was on purpose. The cone itself carried its patterns forward like a kind of punctuation. Wafers rolled into tubes used to hold custards and creams. Street corners in summer asked them to hold weather frozen. The cone said yes, because cones are agreeable. The ridges catch drips and draw them toward patience. A child learns early that gravity negotiates. Somewhere a boardwalk carves the maritime day into intervals measured by licks. Somewhere a narrow street in an old town smiles at a tourist who did not expect a centuries-old baking method to be wearing a scoop of pistachio. The iron mold is gone or hidden, but the pattern is still visible when the cone decides to pause and be admired for a second. Before it returns to being edible architecture, spices moved from miracles to habits without resigning their dignity. Pepper is now ordinary, but its old talent for making small bites feel finished remains. Cinnamon went from holy day to Tuesday without complaint. Sugar left the apothecary cone and learned how to pour. It still tells the brain that the day is not as difficult as it felt. We bought our pleasures from ships and caravans. Now we buy them from shelves that forgot they were once voyages. The effect is the same, a snack that pretends to be minor, and then for a few minutes condenses whole hours to be less dramatic. A bag of candied peel from a fancy shop tastes like the fair where a boy turned a paddle centuries ago and earned a blister that he forgave at once. Salt keeps the conversation honest. We talked earlier about its etiquette, its cellars and boxes, and the way it decides where elbows belong. It still does that. A pretzel without salt is just an interesting knot. Fries without salt are a pencil without graphite. The shaker replaces the standing salt, but the ritual offer, pinch, taste, adjust, remains older than the table. You can see the same motion in a market woman's hand as in a short order cook's, the thumb and two fingers acting like a tiny hourglass. It is not a flourish. It is the part where a thing becomes itself. Containers learn to be useful and then achieve privacy. The medieval trencher, a sturdy slice of stale bread, absorbed the story of the meal and left the table with it. Today, the napkin takes notes instead. Wooden skewers interviewed pieces of meat and reported their findings as street suppers. Now a stick holds a spiral potato or a spiral sweet and nobody objects. Paper wraps learn to accept grease without becoming melodramatic. Wax paper feels like a treaty between appetite and linen. The little wax bag that ensures a pocket will forgive a cookie is a cousin to the parchment sheets that kept honey from regretting itself. Even the string that ties a box knows heredity. Baker's twine migrates from century to century and keeps its work ethic dog. Sometimes the legacy is a technique that pretends to be a flavor. Boiling before baking is a texture. Contract. Par frying is a working relationship with time. Resting batter is patience with a whisk attached. A cook today reads Leave for 10 minutes and thinks of laundry or messages. A cook then watched bubbles turn from bragging to breathing and learned by looking. The continuity is in the eyes, more than in the cookbook. Hands learn when to turn, when to fold, when to accept that the center is ready. Those moments are coins that spend across centuries. Even the small laws kept their tone. There used to be rules about where you could fry, when you could sew, how much a scoop should hold, and whether a bell should be rung before a stall opened. There still are rules about where trucks can park, how hot oil must be to please inspectors, and what a label promises a person in a hurry. The tone is the same, courteous, fussy, protective of neighbors and afternoons. Once there was an assize of bread. Now there are health codes. Both believe that fairness and soup can coexist. A vendor today posts a sign about allergens with the same scolding kindness that a market officer once applied to the size of a bun. If you look for deep changes, you will miss the best part, which is how snacks resist being dramatic. They exist in the middle of things, between jobs, between errands, between a bell and another bell. In the past, they soothed a fast day into a feast you were allowed to have. In the present, they escort an email into a walk that decides to be a break. A honey cake still behaves like weather. A waffle still behaves like architecture. A ring still behaves like an answer to a question nobody needed to ask. We have added names and paper and marketing that speaks in large fonts. The food continues to speak in small ones. Sometimes the legacies fold back on themselves so neatly you can hear the click. A Christmas market sells medieval nuts and cones next to a stand offering hot dough curls with chocolate, which is not medieval at all in that place and time, and nobody is injured by the anachronism. History becomes a seasoning we apply as needed. A cafe prints old recipe on a card and means that the spice drawer smells like grandparents. A baker writes hand pie instead of turnover, and a student buys it with change found in a jacket and eats it on steps that forgot to be a dining room. The step is honored anyway. The small absurdities keep the subject warm. People still argue about whether to salt fries before or after the oil's kiss has fully ended, as if time had a seasoning schedule. Someone insists that pretzels must be twisted left over right for luck and refuses to submit data. A cone that splits at the bottom with impeccable timing teaches a new generation about the emergency napkin plug, a skill as old as generosity. A donut hole is sold back to you as a separate item, and you forgive the economy because the bite is convenient. The line advances 2 people and then pauses so a toddler can choose a pastry with the seriousness of a notary public. No one minds because this is how appetite learns paperwork. By evening, the legacies tidy themselves. Pans are strained through cloth that keeps secrets. Counters are wiped until they feel like new wood remembering old wood. The last cones are stacked. Into next time. The last string is tied around a box that makes the soft thud of a promise. A sign flips to the patient side. Staff take a bite of something lukewarm and perfect, because perfection belongs to temperature as much as to taste. The city inhales and forgets to exhale for a moment, then remembers, then decides it is ready for tomorrow to be nearly the same. You are still listening. You can measure the narrow distance between a fair in 1380 and a kiosk in 2025 with the width of a paper napkin. The hand that pinches sugar has not altered its mind. The skimmer still finds circles with polite efficiency. The cone still agrees to hold the cold part of summer. The pretzel still goes shiny where water met heat. The gingerbread still makes a room smell as if time had agreed to be kind. There's not much of a lesson here, which is restful. There's only the small pleasure of recognizing a thing on a street and realizing that people have been solving this. Tiny problem, how to make the next hour bearable with a warm snack. For so long that the solution feels like weather, we can end without finishing. The bag corner keeps its pale stain. The bench keeps a salt grain on its slat that nobody will notice and somebody will inherit. A vendor ties one last knot in twine and makes it neat because neatness is a lullaby. The market lights dim in whatever order they prefer. If you drift now, you will not miss anything that cannot be repeated tomorrow. The legacy of medieval street food is simply that we still like to walk and eat and feel, for a quiet minute, that the day has agreed to be simple. The paper knows this. The pastry knows this. Your hands already know it, and they are very willing to hold the knowledge while you sleep.